Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. And it's my honor to say that joining us now for one of our conversations with leading strategists is retired United States Marine Corps General Jim Jones, former National Security Advisor to President Obama, former Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who is now chairman of the Atlantic Council think tank. He's also with the Jones Group Consultancy. He's also a former Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, as well as one of the true greats of the Georgetown basketball program. This strategy series is dedicated to the memory of one of America's greatest strategists, Andy Marshall, the former director of the Office of Net Assessment. General Jones, great to have you aboard, and Hoya Saxa.
Thank you, Vago, and I just have to dial down your Georgetown categorization. I try to keep my grade point average and my scoring average somewhere closely together, so it gives you an idea. But I enjoyed playing basketball at Georgetown and have many friends as a result, lifelong friends as a result of that.
And there is something about sports that does teach you about strategy and how to think strategically, and maybe we can get to that later in the conversation. But first, I'm going to start off with, there's a tendency to overplay the impact of any crisis, right? And but despite that, there's a realization that this is the worst health and economic crisis that we've seen in generations. And for the first time since World War II, U.S. global leadership has been absent. Nations have increasingly turned inward. International organizations and institutions are under fire, and now tensions are soaring with China. How's the coronavirus pandemic going to change the global security environment and dynamic?
Well, that's a great question to start with. I think the other thing that's been happening is we've seen a rise of what I call smart autocracies, like China and Russia, Iran, even to a certain extent. And we've seen, I think, a weakening of democracies. And I think that has been underpinned by a return to more of a bipolar world than the multipolar world that everybody thought was going to take place, and probably almost did take place. But I think that for now, at any rate, the bipolarity of the world order is being reinstated just about every single day. And I think the virus will probably continue to accelerate that as the division between China and the United States on exactly what happened and who's responsible continues to sharpen every single day. I think that with regard to the strategic implications of the virus and our strategy, for me, it reinforces the need for a much more comprehensive understanding of how broad the conception of national security has become, that it encompasses transboundary threats that are not just military and kinetic. And we should be planning and posturing ourselves to anticipate the defeat and recover from the full spectrum of these kinds of threats, whether they be pandemic, natural disaster, economic catastrophe, resource scarcity, and so on. Second, I would say that a sharpening of our vigilance of adversaries at this vulnerable time and doing what we can to discourage them from taking advantages of these dire circumstances to make any kind of provocative moves is important, whether it be China and Hong Kong, Russia on its perimeter, Iran, and so on and so forth. Third, I would say we should assure our personnel and military readiness in the face of the virus and do everything we can to keep our edge and preparedness while making and managing transmission risks. And fourth, I would say this, we should see this pandemic not just as a time for domestic and global crisis, but also one in the aftermath of which we should see enormous opportunity to do a couple of things. One, is to your basic introduction, to reassert U.S. global leadership in solving this problem with advanced therapies, very strong public diplomacy. And we should harness our global comparative advantage to help come to the rescue of those who are less fortunate, and not use this situation as a reason to pull up the drawbridge and sink further into the chasm of isolationism. Second, I would say communicate and compare the contrast of democracy with autocracy at every turn. And the president alluded to that a little bit in his speech. While no one has been perfect in handling the situation, the openness and transparency of democracies should stand the test of time as the COVID story unfolds and becomes clearer and clearer. I think we should also use this opportunity to push back on China as a global model that countries might seek to emulate. And we should push internal political reform to make us a lot more agile and a lot more functional and cohesive in how we respond to these threats. So that's kind of my take on some of the possibilities of the paths we could follow in the aftermath of the pandemic.
Well, we fueled China's rise. We bought its goods, we shared our technology, we educated Chinese students, and that built enormous wealth that Beijing is now able to use, including to develop capabilities to assert hegemony and stress our allies and even our forces. Numerous administrations have recognized the problem. Few had a truly integrated response to it. This administration has talked tough. We heard a little bit of that tough talk from the president this afternoon. But there are some folks who are still left wanting in terms of that clarity. In fact, Beijing is has been telling our allies and to anybody else who'll listen that this administration is much more interested in trade deals than military action, and that the president has an allergy to that. That's always problematic when an adversary has a sense that you may have claimed military feat. And at this point, China is breaking with the past, and Beijing feels increasingly strong enough to make it clear to the entire world that it doesn't care what anybody has to say about Hong Kong or Uyghurs or Taiwan or anybody else. Numerous news stories have made that clear in terms of Xi having to do this also for his own domestic preservation reasons. How does the United States exert leverage on a nation that's this powerful, this wealthy, and this influential? How does the United States have to lead in this era?
Well, we've had the 20th century experience with the Soviet Union, although the Soviet Union doesn't present nearly the challenge that China presents today, simply because there was nothing in the Soviet Union that anybody really wanted to emulate. Whereas in China, trade and economic power and purchasing power and the speed with which they're able to maneuver and cut deals has been a revelation that shows that internally we need to make some changes so that we can be faster, quicker, and more responsive. But I do think that that this pandemic gives us an opportunity to not just us, but to rally around the democratic countries that are traditionally our friends and allies, and come up with a cohesive response that isn't just an American response. There's no question that over the last two administrations, maybe even three administrations, the United States has lost a considerable bit of standing, its normal standing in the world. And by that I mean not so much its power, either militarily or economic, but its power to inspire people with regard to values and human rights and rule of law, and standing for the brighter side of our humanity. and we've lost some of that, and I deeply regret that. But there's an opportunity now to regain some of that. And but if we're going to talk about this as a standalone problem involving the United States and China, and we don't reach out to our traditional friends and allies, and even countries that are not particularly friendly but are suffering as a result of this, I think we have a unique opportunity to recast the way in which we engage with our friends and allies in a way that's much more comprehensive and much more successful, and actually much more truthful in terms of what China represents on the globe today. And I hope we take advantage of the opportunity.
Is there, you mentioned earlier about sort of something that is a broader and integrated strategy. And there are some folks who look back in the Cold War, and particularly to the Eisenhower administration, of sort of aligning all the arms of national power in terms of doing that. You were National Security Advisor. What's the challenge of aligning all of the arms of national power to deliver those same messages, that it's not too military heavy, that takes into consideration the democratic, the diplomatic, the cultural, and the economic power the nation has, and actually integrating it? I mean, we've been talking about smart power now for 15 or 20 years.
Right. That's it. That's really the fundamental problem, I think, that we face. When I was in the Obama administration, the president was wise in inviting people into the Situation Room on national security issues and international security issues that they would never have been included in previous administrations. Secretary of Energy, for example, the Secretary of Commerce periodically. And then we obviously morphed into Homeland Security as part of the National Security Council. So there were many more people around the table that were participating in the daily debates in the Situation Room. But I don't think that we have completely understood or divorced ourselves from the idea that having the biggest Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps is a solution. And China, I think, in its strategic thinking, has done a pretty good job of doing that, because I still do a lot of travel around the world and talk to both public and private sector leadership in various countries. And, if you're in Africa, they're saying, "Where are you? Why are the Chinese running all over the place and you're not here?" In other countries, they say, "You send one undersecretary around to see us every 6 months. The Chinese send 25 people every month to manage the business that we're doing with them. Why is that?" And so I don't think we've really come up with a formula that allows us yet to compete at pace with the global events and to be able to react as quickly as the autocracy can. And democracies, by definition, or certainly by history, are slower but more effective in the long term. I think part of that, part of the answer to your question, Vago, is to understand that within our agencies, we need some pretty comprehensive reforms. I've long advocated that in the State Department, we should think much more regionally and not try to run everything from Washington, D.C. And we should empower our ambassadors. We should divide the world up into regions. And I believe that we could put instruments of other agencies co-located with our military headquarters in the combatant commands in different spots geographically around the world, so we can compete in the same time zones and so on and so forth. we have some advantages that nobody else has. We have these unified commands all over the world, and certainly in every geographical section. But it isn't. They aren't beyond the military coefficient of the problems. They don't do too much else with regard to economic policy, with trade and energy and cybersecurity and so on and so forth. That's all done somewhere else, and so some basic reorganization, I think, is called for. And then some think tanks have done some great work on that. The Atlantic Council has got some great documents that they've done on how this could be done. CSIS has talked about it, and others. So this is not a foreign concept, but I don't think that we've completely solved the problem yet.
Part of deterrence is your adversary recognizing your will to use force. So it doesn't really much matter if you have the world's most potent military if your adversary is fairly convinced that that's not an avenue you're going to go down. When it comes to this kind of increasingly assertive China, there is a view that actually this decoupling that we're in will make China, will give everybody a little bit less influence or leverage over China. At the end of the day, what's the right blend of carrots and sticks here? Or is this something that China is on the path that it is on, and it is going to be quite juggernaut-like in achieving it, so that we may be able to surge 7 carriers and a bunch of submarines? But one of the things we've learned about China is its persistence, right? People stand up to it once or twice, but eventually that melts away. What's the right way to try to do this? What's the carrot and stick blend that's necessary for the future?
Well, I do think that maintaining your military capability and communicating the fact that it is there, and that it's the instrument of last resort, but it's not one that we would be reluctant to use. I think the nearest threat from China in the kinetic world of conflict is probably in the South China or East China Sea. By the way, I think ultimately someday they might precipitate something just to test our resolve. But I don't really think that an all-out war with China is in the cards anytime in the future that I see. On the other hand, if that's all we have to deal with, and we ignore our leadership responsibilities, or we're not successful in implementing our leadership responsibilities in our relationships around the world, particularly in the instruments, the institutions that exist, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, very useful projects like the 3 Seas Initiative in Central and Eastern Europe. If we don't project leadership, engaged leadership, if we don't empower our ambassadors to have a much stronger voice without having to go back to Foggy Bottom, to get talking points, if we're not more visible than we are, and if we keep projecting the sense that really deep down inside we want to be isolationists and we don't want to deal. We want to go back to, back in time. Then if that's what we do, then that'll be a big mistake. The other thing, Vago, I would say is, and this is an obvious statement, but it bears repeating, I think. All empires have a beginning and an end in history. From as far back as you want to go, you can. Your history, but and there's a reason for the end of an empire. Either they collapse from within, or they collapse as a result of some cataclysmic event like a war, and they're defeated. There's a sense, I think, that in the American public that somehow there's a destiny that we're always going to be the strongest and the most powerful country on the planet. I would say that for those who think that, they're not really thinking it through. we ought to think about how we came to this position and what generation provided this tremendous opportunity, which was not that long ago. And then we ought to ask ourselves, okay, where do we want to be 20 years from now? And what are the obstacles that are in our way, both internally to our country and externally? And what do we need to do to achieve those goals that everybody somewhat takes for granted? And that gets into issues of things like education, some sort of national service for upcoming generations, and a greater sense of a greater awareness of the word we rather than the word I in terms of how we look at things. And it's not over. I mean, we're in a struggle, but I don't think that there's any manifest destiny here that guarantees that, you know, we don't have to do much because we are Americans and we're used to winning.
That's a very historical view, sir. And, you know, it's very, very hard, and it takes a long time to build something. And I think that sometimes you take for granted the very institutions and structure that allowed you that greatness at the end of the day. I want to ask you a broader question about how we sort of get there in a moment, but let me ask you a slightly more tactical question. The president made an address today. His supporters are saying it's the toughest statement, certainly in their view, that an American president has made since Tiananmen. There are others who would dispute that. The president put withdrawing from the World Health Organization as number one, talked about a proclamation about Chinese students studying in the United States, that a board would study the structure of Chinese companies and how they operate in the West. And then lastly, that special status could be withdrawn from Hong Kong. There is a concern that many people have that if the United States response and the world's response is not tough enough on Hong Kong, and that Beijing succeeds in Hong Kong, it's not a big step for Beijing to go after its other strategic priority, which is Taiwan. How are these interlinked, and were the administration's actions today sufficient to the challenge that we face, given what China is doing or Beijing is doing in Hong Kong?
The purpose of the administration was to articulate a position that most Americans on either side of the aisle would agree to, would agree as things that should be done. Then he's probably taken a good first step. But if you're embarked on a strategy to get the Chinese government to change its tack in its current direction, I think we have a long way to go. But it's not impossible. What I think it's going to take, and I'm not talking about military action here, although there's a military role, I think, a military presence type role to play to convey the seriousness of our intent. But this is, going back to a previous discussion, this is an opportunity for the president to reestablish the role of the U.S. presidency globally on matters pertaining to economy, energy, cybersecurity, the financial markets, and so on and so forth. And I'm absolutely confident that if he does that, and if he's able to convince the watching world that the United States is not going to retreat, or fundamentally not retreating from its traditional roles, and in contrast is reasserting itself in ways that only it can. But it makes it a collaborative effort, not just a one-dimensional U.S. effort, and you're either with us or you're against us. Then you can dramatically modify, I think, the behavior of the Chinese government, because you'll be limiting what they can do economically, financially, and that role can be taken over by the United States and its friends and allies. there's an opportunity in Asia to formulate an economic alliance with quite a few countries to create somewhat of a counter-economic vortex to the Chinese ever-expanding vortex economically. Those kinds of things, I think, are what really need to be done. And if we do that, and we do that in a way that is collaborative, is respectful of the contributions that everybody can make, then you can, I think, create an environment where the Chinese juggernaut will not only slow but atrophy, unless they change their behavior. But if you don't do something like that, if you're just going to rely on military presence, then I think we'll miss a huge opportunity that presents itself as a result of this tragic pandemic.
Does it matter if the United States is on good terms with its allies? Because there are some in the administration who downplay the importance of allies, look at it as much more bilateral, disdain for international organizations, and that in this competition with China, you're either with Washington or you're not. And there's a sense that where else are allies going to go? So we can strong arm them on trade. We can strong arm them on military contributions. We can press them for greater basing monies. I mean, can you have an alliance that has these issues that are running hot in the background? I mean, can you antagonize your allies, I guess what my point would be, and still have a successful alliance?
I would offer that that's the hardest way to do it. A lot of relationships between countries exist because of a relationship between the two heads of state. It's much harder to have a good relationship bilaterally with any country if the two heads of state vehemently dislike each other. And so if you really want the easy road, if you want the easy way, you work on the concept, but you also work on the relationship. I don't see in the last couple of administrations, I don't see our administrations doing the kind of work you need to build the personal relationship so that the broader relationship can thrive. Nobody likes to be embarrassed publicly. But there's a lot of name calling. There's a lot of public vitriol going across the airwaves about certain leaders in certain countries and so on and so forth. I just believe that there's another way to do that. I've seen it many times. As you know, I grew up in post-war Europe, and I grew up during the height of the esteem in which the United States was held as a result of our actions in World War II, and I just know it can. I just know that that's the best way to go, to have it both ways. But I'm absolutely convinced that that there has to be a coalition that stands together. And if the American president is not esteemed and admired and respected, then it's very, very hard to get over that personal animus and form a collaborative body that withstands the Chinese challenge. It is incredible to me to see statistics that show that the Chinese and Russian leaders are in some countries held in higher esteem than the American president. That should not be acceptable. And if that is a true statement, then we need to do a lot of work to correct that. But I do think you can change the Chinese behavior, but it's got to be, they've got to see that globally what they're doing and the way they're doing it and the values that they stand for is not acceptable. And that means some pretty stiff measures taken internationally to restrict their membership in certain organizations, to withdraw some of the most favorable economic clauses that they have as still a developing country, and so on and so forth. And eventually, I think you might get there, but it's going to be a tough road, because we're starting from a position of some disadvantage that we're not used to.
Well, and of course, there's the amoral pull of Chinese foreign policy, where we care about democracy, but they don't, right? Which they've taken enormous advantage of. Well, let me ask. Go ahead.
I completely agree with that. I would say that, and I didn't say it just now, but where are the democracies that used to talk about human rights and values during the days of the Soviet Union? And all of a sudden, because they have trade deals with China, they give China a pass on the fact that they have 1 million Muslim Chinese in concentration camps being so-called re-educated.
Right.
That absence of that kind of dialogue is as harmful as capitulating to anything the Chinese are doing. Appeasement is not a strategy against Russia or China or any autocracy like that.
Let me take you to technology. You mentioned coalition. Britain is suggesting a coalition on 5G technology. I know that that's something that you're very passionate about, because we are in a technological race with a country that's in engineering, communications, autonomy, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, you name it, superpower, and in some areas better, or offering better technology than we are. What are your top sort of 5 security concerns, and how do we address them? In particular, to get your sense on 5G, which you've said secure communications is at the heart of everything we've got to do going forward.
It pivots around everything that we're going to do, whether it's in our economies, whether it's in the protection of our critical infrastructure, whether it's protection of our intellectual properties, whether it's our military capabilities, whether it has to do with energy, and so on and so forth. The driver for the foreseeable future is going to be what we do in the cybersecurity domain, because it will affect everything else. And so there's an urgency for the United States to not only get into the 5G world, and by the way, everybody is going to get into the 5G world at some point. But I would underscore that we don't want to be just in the 5G world. We want to be in a secure 5G world, because this is the critical digital infrastructure that will directly affect our national security, and it'll allow our nation to remain economically competitive. You know, when I was 13 or 14 years old, living in Europe, and the Russians launched the Sputnik satellite, first satellite around to circumnavigate the globe, the headlines in the newspapers screamed, Soviets beat US into space. And actually in Europe, relatively close to the end of World War II, they were talking that communism is really the wave of the future. And in some countries, right. I know in France they were.
Italy also, the movement was very powerful in Italy and Spain and even in Germany.
Exactly. The communism was really the wave of the future. And then we know what the rest of the story is. We have President Kennedy, who at the presidential level set the country on a course to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely. That was done, and the rest is now history. So I think where we are right now is at another turning point, flex point, if you will, where we need that same presidential voice that makes a declarative position that on secure 5G, we are going to enter and dominate and offer alternatives to the Chinese model that is autocratic, that is destined for control of human beings inside countries, and will be in direct opposite in terms of what it can do to transform our own societies. The recently released DoD 5G strategy is to be applauded, but I'd put a caveat that it needs to lead to a cohesive national strategy and a sense of urgency for coast-to-coast digital infrastructure, and that commitment still has not been made. In our country, the secure 5G technology is here, believe it or not. It is actually here. It's been tested. It's proven, but it has not been deployed. And part of the reason for that is because when you go to the interagency and you go to the different departments, what 5G represents in every department is different. It's different from in the energy department, it's different in DoD, it's different at state, it's different at commerce, it's different everywhere. And we have yet to see a cohesive structure announced as a national goal, much like the moonshot, that will allow us to prevail and dominate the building of the critical infrastructure for the 5G world we're going to, but also to protect the legacy systems that we currently have and make them secure. And by the way, we have that capability today as well. So there's a big difference between what a secure democratic 5G installation would look like versus the autocratic installation, privacy, sovereignty, security versus surveillance. We have some legislative incentives such as the Rural Broadband Initiative that would assist in allowing rural areas to join a true coast-to-coast modern digital infrastructure. I see there are two camps in the government. One is focused on hardware, and the other one is focused on software virtualization of 5G, which has been slowing down a cohesive strategy. And those things need to be resolved, but I would advocate it and continue to advocate for a much more cohesive, empowered national team, if you will, that can bring all of this together from the private sector and the public sector.
And role of our allies?
Well, the allies have some capability, but they don't have the end-to-end capability that the U.S. can bring to it. And to my knowledge, nobody has the secure component that superimposed on any G network from 2G to 5G will make that network completely secure and impenetrable. That is, in my view, that is a U.S. capability that is almost unique. And if you look at an organization like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that now has 30 countries, that should be a no-brainer as to where we would first want to make sure that our friends and allies in this critical alliance also have the benefit of this technology, and we can do that.
Let me, you mentioned something a little bit earlier about sort of we have to think about where we want to be 20 years from now, and build the strategy and align ourselves to try to get there. I want to talk to you about that strategy and what do you think it is and where we should envision ourselves to be in, say, 20, 30 years. Because that's what strategy is, right? I mean, where do you want to go? Where do you want to be in an X period of time so you marshal best your resources? And it would seem to me that the number one problem we face domestically is that we are awash in a degree of disinformation that prohibits us to even understand reality and fact as it is. And whether it's Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, part of their strategy is a very disinformation strategy, right? To destroy the other argument, make all arguments equal, very much whataboutist. So at the end of the day, what's the strategy we need? Where do we envision ourselves to be? And how can we get there in an environment of disinformation where every single person is effectively empowered and has a bullhorn to tell even the smartest people that they're stupid, which has a tendency of sort of making it very hard to lead, fundamentally.
And by the way, our adversaries have that same bullhorn.
Right, correct. Which they're blowing into our system, and our system is amplifying within our borders, right? So it's not exclusively the Russians did it or the Chinese did it. It's our own elements are picking it up and amplifying it. So where do we need to be? How do we get there? And how do we address that part of the problem, which seems to me the biggest impediment toward the national unity we need to get there?
That's a very tough question. And I think the answer is, whatever the answer is a long-term answer, because I think it goes into our education system, what we teach, how we teach it, what we want our young people to grow up to be, what it means to be a functioning member of a society. I use the pronouns we and I earlier in our discussion, and I do believe that there's a deep sense of patriotism, and you see all kinds of expressions of that today. And as a veteran myself, starting my career in Vietnam and looking at the ways in which the U.S. military is looked at by our society is a phenomenal change. But I do think that since we went to the all-volunteer force and we did away with the conscripted force, which was a good thing to do, but I think we also jettisoned a little bit the idea that there is a price to be paid by everybody who lives in this land of opportunity at some point to try to do something for the common good. And a lot of people do that. I'm not advocating that, we restore a conscripted force. I don't think so. But I think somehow we need to convey to our people all over the country that there is value and tremendous value in everybody understanding that the United States to consider on its path to greatness and continued global relevance, we all have to do what we can to advance the common good. And part of that has to do with how we reach out to our friends and allies, and how we set ourselves up as an example to other countries to say, I want to be like that. That's what we want to be like. And we had that for a while. And as we discussed, we've lost it a little bit for one reason or the other, but it doesn't mean it's irretrievable. But it's the other thing we suffer with, Vago, a little bit is compared to an autocratic system, is the autocratic system doesn't turn over. So they're able to think strategically because the people are going to be there for a long, long time. We, as you know, the president serves a maximum of 8 years. Senators 6 years. Congressmen have to be reelected every 2 years. And we have tremendous changeover. And but if we don't have consistency in our strategic goals and objectives, and we have one administration after the other comes in and tears down what everything the previous administration tried to do,
right,
that is not particularly helpful for the long range strategy that the country can rely on. On the other hand, if in fact there is some advantages to change, in the sense that if you're not embarked on the right strategy, you can change it pretty quickly, whereas in autocracy, they
Right.
tend to ride that strategy forever, and like the Soviet Union did until they eventually collapsed. So it's a tough question. The answer is probably a long-term answer, but trying to get people to think strategy before tactics is really the secret sauce here, I think.
What are your other top concerns and how we should address them? We talked a little bit about 5G, but what are some of your other top concerns that you think senior leadership should be paying attention to and ways to think about solving it?
Well, I think aside from responding to the Chinese challenge and Russian nuisance and Iranian terrorist, the propagation of terrorist activities all over the world. And with regard to the pandemic, I would say one of the things that I would worry about is how inspired non-state actors might be to see what happened with a virus that that spread as quickly as it did and caused so much damage. The nightmare scenario that I would see as a result of this is that you see terrorist groups now, abandoning the idea of or moving away from the idea of hijacking airplanes, which is increasingly hard. But if they think that starting a pandemic is easy, and they gravitate towards that will be a new set of challenges that we'll have to deal with, and not one that will be easy to defeat. So, but the main challenges to me are maintaining our strength, our economic strength, our industrial strength, revitalizing the manufacturing sector, keep making the changes to continue to be a open society, but an open economy as well, with free trade as at the cornerstone, and to invite and to reconnect with our friends and allies in a way that will, in a unified way that will, I think, cause countries like Russia and China, who get treated with much more respect than they deserve in the world right now, in the world's institutions, to modify their behavior without having a global war.
Is Russia weaker now and more easy to deal with, or as nations weaken, does it become more dangerous?
To me, Russia is a declining power. For the life of me, I don't understand why Vladimir Putin gets treated with the respect that he gets treated with, particularly among our Western European friends. I just don't get it. On the one hand, he is leading a very orchestrated sabotage of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the European Union, and causing all kinds of disinformation, and I have to say, very, very skillfully done, and never going so far that the nations that he's targeting, disassociate themselves with Russia. One of the reasons in Europe is true, it's because of the energy dependence on Russia. But with the United States, now as the number one energy power in the world, we can help that dependency. We can help reduce it. Right. So, but to me, Russia is a declining power, and I don't think that. I think we pay much too much attention to what Vladimir Putin says. They have nuclear weapons, but I think that they have limited capability in what they can do beyond being a strategic nuisance in many areas that, through our own fault, we've allowed them to establish themselves in, like the Middle East.
Let me shift to strategy, which is one of the things which I want to get your thoughts on. What are the keys to successful strategy as far as you're concerned? And if you could give me an example, an emulatable example of good strategy or great strategy, and sort of cautionary examples of very bad strategy.
Sure. So in our military schools, it's interesting that we teach the Art of War by Sun Tzu, who famously said that a strategy without tactics is the slow road to victory, but tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And so the first thing you have to think about, we should think about regarding a strategy, is you need one. A lot of people, quite a few people in the military and other countries, and demonstrate the fact that they understand tactics, but they don't understand strategy. And in fact, as I got to be more senior in the U.S. military, the people I surrounded myself with the most were people who demonstrated that they could think strategically and tactically. And those types of people are pretty hard to find. But when you find them, they're worth their weight in gold, because all of a sudden, difficult problems become much easier. Now, to answer your question about an example, I would use the post-World War II example as contrasted to what we've done recently in Iraq and Afghanistan and maybe even Libya. So post-World War II defeated Germany and Japan. And what did we do immediately after that? We helped them rebuild themselves. And it was an orchestrated plan to do that. And look at what Germany and Japan have become since the end of World War II. Because somebody was thinking strategically, that you couldn't just walk away from those countries and let them fend for themselves. Fast forward to maybe, let's say, the post-Korea era. I think South Korea was probably the last country where we had a cohesive strategy that resulted in a stunning success in South Korea, which is now the 10th or 11th largest economy in the world. Then we went off into Vietnam and other forays, notably in Afghanistan, notably in Iraq and Libya, where we entered into some violent conflict, long-term conflict that still is not over. And why is that? Well, we had a kinetic plan. We had a military plan. The military was going to topple whatever regime we wanted to replace. And then what? And as it turns out, not much else. No plan to introduce democracy. No plan to assist governments to rebuild the economic sectors, to teach to influence the education of whatever country we're in. And as a result, no strategic vision. And in fact, in Iraq, in 2003, we went in there with the express announced policy that we were not going to do that. And that, to me, is probably a classic example of failed strategy.
You've had an extraordinary career where you've exhibited strategy in a variety of different jobs, not just Marine Corps Commandant, but NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, and then, of course, National Security Advisor. What are the keys to being strategic in each job, whether you're a platoon commander or a brigade commander or service chief or sitting in the C-suite? What are the keys to being strategic in any job that you're in?
Well, Vago, I think one of the keys is to have the facility of intellect to objectively analyze wherever you are, the strategy that you're being asked to, if you're in the military like I was, you have to think about in the strategic context of what you're being asked to do, and before you start thinking about how you're going to do it tactically. In my Vietnam days as a second lieutenant, first lieutenant, company commander in northern Vietnam up near the DMZ, where we were fighting the North Vietnamese army more than the Viet Cong. You know, I was 23, 24 years old. I commanded a Marine rifle platoon and a rifle company during the Tet Offensive. And, you know, I started thinking about, you know, why it is that we could never cross into the DMZ. Why is it that we could not pursue the enemy into Laos or Cambodia? Why is it that we couldn't do this? Why couldn't we do that? And it struck me that, you know, a lot of the senior generals at the time were generally products of Korea, and in some cases World War II, but mostly Korea. And it struck me as a young officer that this was not the way to win a war. Why didn't we bomb Haiphong Harbor? Why didn't we do so many things that we could have done? But when you're a second lieutenant or a first lieutenant, you know, you're at the receiving end of the trail in terms of how you live and how you fight and what you do and what you don't do. But for me, that was the beginning of kind of an intellectual awareness that you should always think about what it is you're being asked to do, and understanding the strategic intent, and then figuring out how you're going to do it. There are too many times we do just the opposite. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, because I am fascinated by Vietnam and your generation, in part because it really was the war from hell. That on the one hand was a counterinsurgency and just the most god-awful climate in the world, combined with force on force. North Vietnamese army had tanks, artillery. North Vietnam had a competent fighter force that took a toll on its airmen, very, very sophisticated air defense systems that were provided by Russia and China. And so at the end of the day, it was really an extraordinary conflict. And I think there are enormous number of lessons that can be drawn from it, especially as we go into this kind of great power future that is going to be very hybrid. And Vietnam struck me as, I think you've said it best, right? It wasn't a war. It was a whole lot of wars that were flying in unorganized formation, at least seeming to you, right? Unorganized formation.
Correct. Yeah, it was the North was different from the South and different from the central part of the country. Some areas never saw the North Vietnamese army. Some people never saw the Viet Cong. It was chaos. My knowledge of Vietnam starts pretty far north, from Da Nang to the DMZ, and I never set foot south of Da Nang.
You'd never been to Saigon?
Never been to Saigon, and I never called it Ho Chi Minh City either.
We've got just a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask you two other quick questions. One is, the Vietnam War ended because the nation tired of it, which appears to be the case where we are in Afghanistan. And just like in Afghanistan, Henry Kissinger negotiated with the North. The South was not even at the table. We did the same thing in Afghanistan. And now it appears that the Taliban is going to gain control after trillions of dollars of American investment, thousands of lives lost. At the end of the day, what message does it send to the world that the United States, on two of its longest wars, has pretty much run out of juice and just sort of pulled the plug. And what does that tell China if China is looking at this long-term competition with us? And what does it tell anybody else that we may be fighting alongside with?
Yeah, well, to get to your strategic question, I think what it tells you is in the future, American leaders should maybe never undertake a project like we did to change a society, unless you're really willing to do everything that you have to do that. And that means, in the aftermath of the kinetic phase, there has to be something that inspires the people whose lives you're trying to affect in a positive way, in the way they're governed, in the way that they have their hopes and aspirations for the future, and that takes time. And we didn't do that. And in Iraq, we intentionally didn't do that, which is even worse in my view. In Libya, we carpet bombed Libya without even having an American hospital ship off the coast to take care of the civilians, which normally we would have done intuitively, reflexively. We've always done things like that. We've always been there for the weakest and the oppressed and the ones who are suffering the most. And but for me, that's the big strategic lesson. If you're not willing to do what you have to do, and it's not the same thing in every case, but if you're not willing to do the things you have to do, then you probably shouldn't get involved in it in the first place. I believe that that there's a formula for engagement, and it's something along these lines, that if you achieve security, which generally we are pretty good at doing, and you can superimpose, after you achieve security, good governance and rule of law, then you have a chance at the outcome, which is economic prosperity and peace. But if you only do one, and if you only do the kinetic piece, you're probably not going to be successful. To me, that's one of the lessons of my life, particularly as I look at developing countries in Africa and different places, even in our own hemisphere. They need to know that they have security, so that they don't, you don't have a immigration wave that crushes, the European continent or our own. You need to convince people that staying at home is going to be okay, because they're going to be treated fairly and led by moral, competent people who care about their countries as opposed to their own financial well-being. And then you have a chance at achieving stability and ultimate peace and prosperity.
You mentioned sort of thinking about end of empire. Was going into Iraq and Afghanistan, the way that we did them, one of those seminal moments in terms of lost lives, lost resources, trillions of dollars, and not having moved needles very much, one of those things that maybe 100 years from now, people look back at those moments and say, wow, well, I guess that's how the end started? Or do you think that's too extreme way of looking at it?
So Vago, I think that going into Afghanistan was the right thing to do. Where I think we went wrong, and we is not just the U.S. but our allies, but we were the leaders of the coalition, is that we didn't successfully do the things that we needed to do to transform the society to do the things that I just outlined in that simplistic formula. In Iraq, I think we went in for the wrong reasons, and with no intention of nation building, none, zero. And I think that was therefore I think that was I think that was a mistake of historical proportions.
Great nations are often guilty of mirror imaging, building forces for how they imagine they would rather fight than how their adversaries are actually going to be fighting. And there's this concern that we have this mismatch when we're looking at China, that China actually doesn't want to fight force on force. It wants to raise costs to a level that it can fight without winning. Very Sun Tzu, right? Fight without winning.
Exactly.
Are we building the right kind of forces at the end of the day? Are we being clear enough in purpose, which I guess goes to your grand strategy approach in the beginning, but I'm sort of struck by, on the military instrument, it has to be capabilities that your adversary fears. And the minute your adversary looks at your capabilities and concludes they're all pointless, you're in deep doo-doo. Are we sort of thinking as clearly as we need to be thinking about this, along with our allies as well, in terms of the capabilities they'll be bringing to the party?
I think China's strategic aspirations have something to do with military capability, but not nearly as much as most people think. I believe that they are thinking long term, and they've decided that in the world that's facing us, that things like economic power, cybersecurity, technological prowess, scientific advantage, and a whole of society approach will prove to be the successful portion of their strategy that will get them to replace the United States as the most dominant nation on the planet. I think that's pretty clear, and I don't think too many people would agree with that, would disagree with that rather. On our side of the aisle, I don't see that same passion. I see what I see in our national discourse is more of a tactical, they do this, so we'll do that type of response, instead of identifying those areas in which we recognize that we must keep our primacy, which is the same areas that I just articulated that China is focusing on. We must prevail in the cyber world. We simply must. We come in second there, with the danger of coming in second in almost everything else is extremely high. And so I think that we need to think more comprehensively. We need to think longer term, and and I think we need to find greater harmony in our political dialogue on whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, to focus on the pronoun we for the benefit of the country rather than the individual pronoun I, which is for the benefit of the individuals or one party over the other on these very, very important issues.
General Jones, thanks so much for being so generous with your time. Wait a minute, I didn't ask what you learned from sports that helped you be a better strategist. Did anything on the hard court up at Georgetown teach you valuable lessons on how to be a little bit more strategic?
Yeah, I think if the coach had played me more, I would have done better. Sports is a great, team sports in particular, but all sports is a great teacher. Strategically is what you do before the game starts, and then tactics, particularly in basketball, is a very fast-moving sport, and your tactics have to derive from a well-articulated strategy.
Well, sir, it's always an honor and pleasure talking to you. Thank you for being so generous with your time, and look forward to having you back on again soon for a little bit of a deeper dive in 5G, which I know is a very, very key topic that you've spent a lot of time thinking about. Thanks so much again.
That's the battleground, and thank you, Vago, for the privilege of being on your show.
Thank you, sir. And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. And check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight. Bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.